Good. Right. So yes, I'm Rob Hopkins. I am one of the people who started the transition movement, and I spent the last couple of years researching and writing a book which came out in October, which is all about imagination. And so what I want to do here is to share with you some of the key kind of insights and learnings from that process, which hopefully will be something that will be useful to you at CAG or in any of the other community campaigns or activism that you are involved in and that you are part of. There we go. So just to, as Extinction Rebellion would say, to tell the truth, I think it's useful just at the beginning to just to remind us to why we do what we do, why I've been involved in transition for the last 13 years and was a permaculture teacher before then, because we are living through the time of the climate emergency, which is moving faster and more furiously and deeper and more terrifyingly than often the worst forecasts in some cases, and that we're seeing things happening already that weren't supposed to be happening for quite some considerable amount of time. And the thing that got me started on this project of thinking that the imagination was something that was worth looking at was I kept finding myself reading people like George Monbiot and Naomi Klein and Bill McKibben, who would write, climate change is a failure of the imagination. Something about that expression really stayed with me and kind of got underneath my skin. And I couldn't kind of get this thought out of my head of, well, could it be that at the very time when climate change demands that we fundamentally reimagine and rebuild things, as Naomi Klein says, there are no non-radical solutions left. So climate change fundamentally demands us, given that we need to be cutting emissions by 7 to 8% a year starting now, and the changes we saw during the coronavirus led to about a 5.5% decline over 3 months. We need to be seeing 7 to 8% every year starting now, rolling forward. It's huge, and it goes way beyond solar panels and carrots and gets into a whole different kind of level of ambition and level of possibility. So it really got to me, this idea that we might be living through a time of the climate emergency, of sort of decline of the imagination. I kept reading things where I kind of went on a journey with this, where I started out just with that question in my head: climate change is a failure of the imagination. What does that mean? Why would it be that in 2020, when we have so many other things that we're doing really well, we might be living in a time where we are experiencing a failure of the imagination? I kind of came to, there were a couple of interviews that I did during the book that really were pretty pivotal. One of them was with a guy called Henry Giroux, who's an activist in the US, who had written an article where he talked about the Trump disimagination machine, and something about this concept of there being a sort of a systemic interweaving of things that are together, intentionally or otherwise, causing our collective imagination to contract. And there was research that was done in 2010, a researcher in the US who looked at all of this data from a big creativity test called the Torrance Test for Creative Thinking, going back to the 1960s. Her conclusion was that IQ and imagination rose together until the mid-1990s. And then IQ kept rising, but imagination went into what she called a steady and persistent decline. And when this was published, it made the front page of Newsweek. It was a really big story. But I never heard anyone in the climate change, social justice movement say anything about it at all. And I thought, well, actually, you know, if we're experiencing a contraction of the imagination, that's really, really serious. And I've come to think that actually that's happening from various different directions. It's happening partly because when we see a rise in anxiety and trauma and stress, that leads to a shrinking of the imagination. Cortisol as a hormone causes our imagination to shrink, causes the part of our brain that fires our imagination to shrink. Also, when we spend less and less time outdoors, we spend more and more time with these very addictive devices in our pockets that demand that time that we would otherwise spend daydreaming and looking out of the window. We have an economic system that gives us less and less and less space for dreaming. And I recently read a book by a woman called Adrienne Marie Brown, who also talked about colonialism and the links with imagination. She said, imagination is one of the spoils of colonization, which in many ways is claiming who gets to imagine the future for a given geography. Losing our imagination is a symptom of trauma. We are living in the ancestral imagination of others, with their longing for safety and abundance, a longing that doesn't include us. And I feel like we're living in this time where this kind of perfect storm of factors are coming together and causing the imagination to shrink. And the thing that I always like to uh, help people to do is to imagine that the time we're living through right now is the tipping point, that this now is the tipping point. And those of us who campaign on climate change, I meet so many people who campaign on climate change, but who's fundamentally, when you talk to them about it, don't believe it's possible that we can really create a kind of profound systemic social change. And it feels to me really important that we allow space in our imagination to think, well, what if these times we're living through right now are the time we will look back to at the moment when it tips? I went to last October to London for the youth climate strike day, with a general strike. So all the kids came out on strike and asked adults to come. There was about 100,000 people in Parliament Square. Phenomenal buzz and energy and dynamism about the whole thing. And when I was there, I thought, what if this is the day? What if this is the day we look back to as the moment when things tipped? Because you never know a tipping point when you're in it, you only see it in the rear view mirror afterwards. In the same way, the kind of Black Lives Matter revolution that we've seen happening over the last couple of weeks, what if we look back to this as being the beginning of the tipping point, the beginning of things really, really starting to change direction? And it feels so important to me that we make time and space to actually allow ourselves to imagine that. Oops. No. So now I'm going to do a little exercise with you, because I feel like this ability to allow ourselves to step into a future, not a utopia. I'm not for any moment talking about utopias. I'm trying to help us to imagine what it would be like if the next 10 years we did everything we could possibly do, where we might end up. So I'd like to do a little exercise with you where we are going to attempt the first act of online time travel in the history of Oxfordshire. This is a seminal moment that you happen to be here for. This is quite a really moment you'll be able to tell your grandchildren you were here for this moment. So I'd like to invite you, if I may, to get comfortable and to close your eyes. And we're going to do a little act of time travel. So in a minute, when we turn on my time machine, which is just here, you can't see it, it's just slightly out of the frame. When I turn on the time machine, we're going to travel forward to 2030. And we're going to travel forward through those years, which were the most extraordinary time in human history. They're a time that the people who came afterwards tell great stories about and sing great songs about. It was a time where changes that in 2020 felt unimaginable fell in a cascade of positive change. And you're now arriving into a zero carbon Oxfordshire. And the imagination and the creativity that was unlocked during that time was just incredible. And what I'm going to invite you to do when we turn on the time machine is just to take a walk around in that world, in your imagination, using all of its senses. What does it smell like? What does it sound like? What do you hear? What do you feel? What's it like to actually be walking through the everyday of an Oxfordshire that has successfully managed that transition to a low carbon economy? So what I'm going to do is, when I turn on the time machine, we'll just have 2 minutes of silence just to allow you to take that walk into your imagination. And then we're going to pop you into a breakout room with one other person, just to feed back to that person and just to share what you saw, what you felt, and what you heard. Okay, so I'm now going to turn on my time machine and enjoy 2030. It's worth the trip. So Christabel is just going to pop you into a breakout room with one other person for 4 minutes. And if you could just take 2 minutes for the first 2 minutes, the first of you, just to talk about what you saw, and then we'll send a little reminder to say it's 2 minutes and time to change over, and then swap over, and then we'll all come back together again. Any particular kind of overriding impressions or things that really stayed with you, do feel free to just write them down in the group chat. Be lovely just to get a little snapshot of how that landed with you, and if there are any particular things that that you were moved by, or that you saw or experienced. We'll just take a minute just to see what lands in there. One issue is how much we're willing to cope with less, fewer flights, fewer babies, etc., to get communal improvement. We'll need imagination because the opposition will be fierce. We'll talk about that, I'm sure. There'll be no debt and poverty, which frees the imagination to share with your neighbors. More trees and birdsong, feeling of calm. I feel like we did during COVID-19. We had a conversation about that in the room that I was in. How much of the stuff that we actually, when you do this exercise, because I do this exercise with groups of 10, and I've done it with 1,500 people in a hall. And so many of the things that people talk about are what it felt like during the first couple of weeks of COVID, when everything shut down. Lots of local food growing in markets, children playing outside with each other in the street, current leaders getting smaller and smaller and fading into the distance. That sounds marvelous. 4-day week, roads closed to traffic, changed landscape with more woodland, more hedges. Do you know, I've never done this exercise and people have said bigger supermarket. Or anything like that. Okay, well, thank you so much for those. And the reason I always like to do this exercise, and I'm just going to share my screen again in a second. Here we go. Is because I'm going to just, because I feel like there is something really important about when we try to inspire people to get involved with the enormous changes ahead that we have to make. We can either present them with terrifying apocalyptic scenarios and pictures of New York under 50 meters of water, or maybe there's a different way where we show people how it could be if we did absolutely everything that we could possibly do. What is it still possible that we could create? And this is a couple of drawings done by a guy called James Mccoy in Leeds, who draws the future. And draws a future in ways that I just think are beautiful. This is his drawing of what cities could be like if they were designed to maximize the biodiversity of those cities. What would Oxford be like if it was the most biodiverse city in the world? What could it be like if it was the most fertile, abundant, food-producing city in the world? We've seen, as we come out of COVID, a lot of city councils now saying we're going to keep the cars out of these bits, and the push now is to get cars out of city centres. When you do that, there's an awful lot of space that then becomes available to do something with. Why not fill the streets with food being grown everywhere, and our children walking to school past food being grown? And for me, one of the reasons why images like this are so important is there's a beautiful quote by Rilke, the poet Rilke, who said, "The future must enter into you a long time before it happens." I'll say that again because I love it so much. The future must enter into you a long time before it happens. And the future enters into us through images, through storytelling, through you taking the idea, the mental picture that you had in your head just now, and sharing it with others and bringing it to life in different ways. The future must enter into you a long time before it happens. And that's why I feel the imagination is so powerful and so. And so I spent the last couple of years doing a lot of research that went into the book about imagination. What's the state of health of our imagination in 2020? And I came to be really concerned that actually at the very time our imagination should be a superpower, should be a muscle like that. It's actually a muscle like this. And that we're really, that really puts us in a really impoverished position to start this work that needs to happen. So what I want to share with you is this, which, In my house here, I had until about 4 months ago a lodger called Rob, another Rob, who was a student at Schumacher College, and he was doing his thesis, and he was really taken with the work I was doing about imagination. So he had an early draft of the book, and when he'd read it, he then did his dissertation kind of based on it. And one of the things that came out of conversations that he and I had around that time was this, which was a kind of a distillation of the ideas in the book, which arrived too late to go in the book, but I love it, which is, how do we set out now to rebuild the collective imagination? If CAG and different organizations in Oxfordshire decided we want to make the focus to create the best conditions for the imagination to flourish in this county, because unless we do that, the other work we try and do about climate change will always be like trying to push a rock up a hill. How do we create the kind of make the soil more fertile for imaginative ideas to take place? Then I have these 4 things that I'd like to share with you, and I'm gonna go through them one by one and tell you some stories about them as we go. So, space. We all know in our own life that the times we are at our most imaginative are when we have some space. You know, nobody came up with their best ideas sitting in front of their laptop with a deadline at 9 o'clock that night. Nobody came up with their best ideas in a white room with fluorescent light tubes and someone in front of a whiteboard saying, "Ideas, people, ideas." You know, the best ideas come when we're outside, when we're doing something different. So Albert Einstein always said his best ideas came to him when he was riding his bicycle in the forest. Mathematician Andrew Wiley talked about his 3B mantra, that his best ideas came when he was in bed, in the bus, or in the bath, on the bus or in the bath. And, you know, the imagination needs space, and that space has been driven systematically out of our lives. We have less and less and less space. And it's been so interesting during lockdown to see, when people have had some space, this flourishing of imagination, all these incredible films and stuff, people off writing books. And, you know, when you make the space for it, it happens. And it's so important in our movements, in our organizations, that we create that kind of a space. And, you know, Transition and Extinction Rebellion, different movements have been really good at designing into how meetings happen: space for reflection, space for digestion, space for imagining. The Transition movement from the very beginning used open space as a really great tool to bring large groups of people together around a great what if question, to facilitate a sort of a self-organizing conversation where people make the space to go deep into a question and to really explore it in a way that just in our normal lives we're just too busy to do. And I was fascinated to try and find places where people were intentionally creating space kind of at a neighborhood scale. And I visited in Bristol, a street in St George in Bristol was part of a scheme called Playing Out, where they closed the street, and this council had made it really easy for streets to do it, where they close the street and the children play. And they one night a week during the summer, you need a parent at both ends. And I went there, the street's full of chalk drawings and skipping and all scooters and all kinds of stuff. I spoke to a mother who said, "This isn't anti-car, this is pro-community." And once you get the cars out of the way, this is just what happens. The guy who used to be the mayor of Bogota in Colombia used to say that we should see the number of children playing in the streets of our towns and cities as being a key well-being indicator of those places. I spoke to one of the fathers who said, "Well, after 6 months of doing this, we realized that we quite liked each other." Now, you could see the role that actually having kids playing in the street played in the kind of social glue of a street. In my town, we had a festival of street games where we closed the square at the top of the town, and it was filled with kids playing games. And it was amazing. The first half, all the adults stood around saying, "Isn't this marvelous to see our children playing these street games together?" And then the second half, they realized they could play too. And then it was just chaos, but delightful chaos. And you really got a sense of how the role that those games play, and creating space in people's lives for play, and how important play is. This is my favorite game that I learned that day, which is a Dutch game called Spekerpoepen, which means nail poops, literally. You get a nail on the end of a piece of string and you tie it to the back of your skirt or the back of your trousers, and you put a bottle behind you, and looking backwards between your legs, you have to get the nail into the neck of the bottle. And it's just glorious. If any of you have children or grandchildren and you're worried about their attention span, this little girl played this game for about 10 minutes, totally in the zone of making this happen. So You might want to use this at your next work meeting or whatever, but it's a beautiful kind of example of play, and how play in the community created a space for people to come together and to think different. So space is really important. So on a bigger scale, a universal basic income, I think we need to be reframing as a powerful imagination strategy. A 4-day working week, again, I think we need to be reframing as a really important imagination strategy. Ways that we can give people space at a time when we are being worked to death, living in this culture of busyness, obsessive busyness. Space is fundamentally important to a revival of the imagination. The second is places. Gathering places that provide platforms for collective imagination. Places where we can go and we're not quite the same when we leave. We go and it changes our sense of what might be possible. This is a transition group in London, Transition Kentish Town, who a few years ago did an exercise where they bought some beautiful fruit trees, apple trees in blossom. They brought them down to the high street on a Saturday afternoon, and they put them all along the high street. So people could, just for that afternoon, experience what their high street would be like if it were an orchard. And then they stopped people and talked to them about it. And then from those conversations, they found homes for all of those trees. So by the end of the weekend, they had created a kind of patchwork orchard in their community. But just for that afternoon, people walking down that street they knew so well, it looks the same every time, were able to imagine it and see it as an orchard and see things really, really differently. My favorite definition of imagination is the ability to see things as if they could be otherwise. John Dewey, the educationalist, said. This is in Berlin, Princess Innengarten, a most amazing urban farm, urban agriculture project, which is one of the biggest tourist attractions in Berlin. After you've been there and you've spent an hour walking around in Princess Innengarten, your sense of what urban spaces can be is completely changed. You find yourself walking off to go somewhere else. Everywhere you look, you're thinking, oh, you could be growing some food in there. You could be growing some food in there. It kind of changes the way that you then go on to look at the spaces that you go to after that. This is a guy who lives in Houston called Jason Roberts, lovely guy, who runs a project called Better Block. What Better Block do is they find really unloved places that nobody really cares about. And they speak to the people around that and they say, what are your dreams for this place? What are your dreams for the future? And then in their lab, they create this stuff and then they arrive at dusk. This place that everybody goes past every day looks exactly the same. And overnight, they assemble this completely different thing. So the next day, people arrive and a space that did look like this, nobody loves this place. This is not a place that anybody has a great attachment to. And overnight, they transform it into this. And I love this idea of creating kind of pop-up tomorrows. How would you take a place in Oxford, a place in Oxfordshire that people know really, really well, and overnight transform it into the visions that you had at the beginning of this process? So apart from having a coronavirus lockdown, which actually has done a beautiful job of creating a kind of pop-up tomorrow in some ways, although of course it's not the route by which anybody would do this. But you know, I love this idea that you take a place and you transform it into how it could be. You don't always need to do something as big and bold and ambitious as that. This is a lovely thing that started in San Francisco and now happens all around the world, called Parking Day, where a group of artists in San Francisco who were looking for cheap exhibition space and couldn't find any in San Francisco realized that actually if you bought a parking ticket for a parking space, there's no law that says you have to put a car in it. You can do whatever you like in a car parking space. So they all go along on this day and they buy tickets, and then they do other things in the space. So they do yoga in it, for example, as you can see here. They fill it with board games and people can come by and play games. People make little libraries and little cafes in them. A couple even got married in one, I think, a little while ago. They do whatever on earth this is. I have absolutely no idea. But the point is they take those spaces and they transform them and they give people a sense of how things could be different. And I love Parking Day. And I know Transition Liverpool are hopefully going to do part of places can also be whole settlements. You know, there are some places now who have been doing transition long enough and ambitiously enough and kind of joined up enough that they now exist as a really interesting multifaceted example of what this could be like. This is a town in the northeast of France called Ungersheim in Alsace, in that corner where Switzerland and Germany or Austria meet, up in that corner. My geography is terrible. Anyway, up there used to be, it's an old mining town, and in the 80s all the mines closed and they lost lots of jobs, and there's a guy called Jean-Claude Mensch whose father was a miner. He was a miner and a union organizer, and he became the mayor of Ungersheim. And a couple of years into being the mayor, someone showed him a video about the transition movement, and at the end he said, let's do that, all of that. And when you go to Ungersheim, it's like a kind of a joined up example of transition. It's beautiful. They have the biggest solar farm in Alsace. All the food in all the schools is 100% organic, and most of it is grown in a market garden on the edge of the town. They're building straw bale co-housing projects. They're building this amazing building here as a place to kind of value add and process a lot of the food coming out of the garden to create more jobs. They have a local currency called the radish. They're just doing all kinds of amazing things. They sold their school bus and they bought a horse instead. And this is a picture in the middle of when I went to visit, and I was taken around like the Queen to go and visit all these amazing projects. So they have, so it's the most amazing, inspiring example. But the thing that you see running through it all is the story of it. And when you speak to people, the number of people who say, well, you know, I used to be really lonely and isolated, and now I feel part of something. And there's a film called What Are We Waiting For? Qu'est-ce qu'on attend? A French film about Ungersheim, which has been really popular all across France. And a thing that you see in that film more than anything is the number of people who say, who are having more and more meals in each other's houses, who are connecting more. You see the social fabric of this place weaving itself together because of the projects. It's almost more important than the actual projects themselves. So having places that are able to tell that kind of multifaceted story is really important. So I'm going to show you this, and then I'm going to go back to that. Okay, so that's places. We need places which can inspire us. The third one is practices. We need things that we do with other people that unlock this sense of possibility. So this amazing woman is called Rosalie Somerton. And Rosalie Somerton works in Dundee. And she started and works for a project called Art Angel. And Art Angel work with people who have mental health issues or burnout or anxiety or trauma and stress. And part of why I was really interested to see them was that I did a lot of research about this particular part of your brain called the hippocampus. Hippocampus is where your memory sort of fires from, but it's also where your imagination fires from. Any networks that fire in your brain when you're being imaginative have the hippocampus at their heart. The thing that is so interesting about the hippocampus is that it is the part of the brain that is uniquely vulnerable to cortisol. When we are anxious or in stress or in trauma, the hippocampus can shrink by up to 20%. And when that happens, we lose that ability to look at the future in kind of positive and hopeful ways. We just get stuck down into the present or stuck into the past. And what they're doing and I was really interested to see if I could find a place that was intentionally setting out to kind of rebuild the hippocampus, to expand the hippocampus, a kind of a campus for the hippocampus, if you like. And so up in Dundee at Art Angel, that's exactly what they're doing. And they say, when you walk through the door here, you're not a patient, you're not a client, you're an artist who is preparing work for an exhibition. And they do photography and they do all kinds of different art. And everybody that was there knew I was coming up, and they were really happy to tell me their stories. And it was just wonderful. And you could really see how people were starting to kind of build back their sense of imagination and their sense of what's possible. And I spoke to one woman who told me she'd spent the last 4 years in her pajamas. And she said, since I've been coming here, I can see the future again now. And I met so many people who had stories to tell like that. It was really powerful. And one of the things that they do every year to keep their funding going is they have to do a kind of an appraisal of how well it's going. And rather than giving everybody a big kind of questionnaire or whatever, they just give them a piece of paper with two kind of gingerbread man cutter sort of outlines of human body. And they say, fill the first one in to show how you felt before you came here, and fill in the second one to show how you feel now you've been coming here for a little while. And I'm just going to show you one of these, which doesn't really need much commentary, I think. And I looked through a big pile of these things. There were so many of these that were very, very similar to this. And it really communicates to me the power of what they were doing. and actually how having a life with a healthy imagination is our healthy natural state. And it's being imaginative is really a function of good health, I think. And that actually also, if we are able to do everything that we need to do in the next 10 years to achieve the kind of low carbon, zero carbon economy that we need, I think this is what it'll feel like. This, for me, represents what the shift of the next 10, 15 years will feel like. Yeah, they're doing extraordinary work. So what other practices could we use apart from the kind of thing they're doing at Archangel? When I asked them, how do you do this? They said, fundamentally, this is about safety and hope. What we do here is about creating safety and hope. Two things which many, many people don't have very much of at the moment. So this is an exercise, a practice that we developed in the transition movement, working with Encounters Arts, who are an amazing community arts organization called Transition Town Anywhere. And for Transition Town Anywhere, you need a big space. You need between 200 and 400 people, and you all come in to the space, and you do an exercise like we did at the beginning. You imagine you're going forward to 2030 into a future where everything that could possibly have been done was done. And then you imagine what it would be like, and then you think, well, what's my role in this future? What am I doing in this future? And then you meet other people who share your area of interest, and together you plan something that you would be doing together in this future. And then with the other people, you actually build it with cardboard and bamboo canes and string and sticky tape. You build a kind of a three-dimensional, living, breathing, inhabited version of that future. So you have 300 adults completely lost in play, in imagining this world that you've created. Then you trade in it, you celebrate in it, you grieve in it, you eat in it, you inhabit this space in an extraordinary way. When we first did it in 2012, I still meet people who I haven't seen since then. And very soon the conversation comes around to, they say, oh, do you remember that thing we did in Battersea Hall in the Arts Centre? And they get all kind of misty-eyed when they start talking about it. Really deeply touches people. And we did it recently, last October, in the same venue. These two young men here built the transportation system for Transition Town Anywhere. This might look to you like a few chairs and a couple of cardboard boxes. They could tell you everything about how the public transport system in Transition Town Anywhere worked, what the tickets were like, what the seats were made of, everything about it, because in their imagination it was a fully three-dimensional thing. It's a really, really powerful way of doing things. And just as an example of how it can lead to things actually in the real world. This is me in 2012 when we did this exercise. And I ended up with a group of people where we created something called the Yeast Collective, which is community bakers and brewers since 2012. And it was a brewery and a bakery and a mill in the same space. We spent all day playing it and trading in it, and I could still tell you what all the beers were called and how our training program worked, everything about it. The following year in my town, we started a real brewery called the New Lion Brewery. If you're ever in Totnes, call by, it's fantastic. And last year, we converted the whole business to being a community benefit society, and we invited people to invest, and we raised £180,000 from 270 investors who are now our owners. And when people would say, when we were doing Lionshare to raise the money, they'd say, but Rob, how do you know this is going to work? I would say, I know this will work because I played it. I absolutely fundamentally know this will work because I've played it. And once you've played something, it puts you into a place where it's just very, very, very different how you actually know how possible things are. This is James Mccoy, who did those drawings I showed you at the beginning. This is one of his practices for unlocking the imagination. He goes out in Leeds and he sets his easel up by the side of the street and he just starts to draw what's in front of him. And as people walk past, he says, excuse me, how do you think this place might be in the future? And they tell him, and then he adds that into his drawing. And he says, all you need is a really simple sketch and people's ideas flow. And he said, when I started doing this work, I was really pessimistic about the future. But the more time I've spent doing this, I now feel more and more hopeful about what we could create. This man works for the Swedish government, and his name is Per Gronqvist, and his official job title is Chief Storyteller to the Swedish government.
Are we supposed to be seeing your screen at the moment? Because we didn't see anything of James in Leeds. I didn't know. I got the impression you were trying to show us something.
Oh, I was, yeah. I'll just do that again, and then hopefully. Is that Better? Can you see that now?
Yeah, I thought you were just teasing us.
Can you see it now, though? Yes, good.
Look, we can, yeah. And we
Okay,
did
so
see it
this is,
before.
okay. So this is Per Gronqvist. And I'll just show you the picture before that you missed. Some of you might have missed. Will I? No. That's James Mccoy doing his picture by the side of the street. So this is Per Gronqvist. His job is the chief storyteller, and his job description is to communicate the realities of day-to-day living in a carbon neutral world. To communicate the realities of day-to-day living in a carbon neutral world. What a beautiful job description. I feel like everywhere should have a chief storyteller. Every organization should have a chief storyteller. We should all be fully trained to be chief storytellers, because that skill of communicating the realities of day-to-day living in a carbon neutral world is one of the most important and precious things we need to be. So how could we create an economics framework or a political framework in which the imagination is invited? That's one of the things that I discuss quite a lot in the book. I think if you look at somewhere like Preston with what they call the Preston Model, where they bring a different approach to the economics of a city, to say that the aim is to get money to circulate locally as many times as possible, that creates so many openings and possibilities, bringing in the kind of designing the economic underpinnings, the democratic underpinnings that allow imagination to flourish, unlike those at the moment, which just contracts it down and makes it disappear. So one of the main practices I feel like we need to be cultivating at a community scale is the ability to ask really good what-if questions. I just want to tell you a couple of examples of my favorite what-if questions. This is in Tooting in London, where this is a bus turning circle in Tooting. Tooting is a busy high street, lots of shops. There's nowhere that's like a village green, a town square, a kind of people's. There's one place it could be, which is here, which is currently a bus turning circle. So this space is full of buses all day, their engines idling, the air quality is horrible. Nobody loves this place. Nobody stops to hang out here unless they're a bus driver. So Transition Town Tooting last July did an event called the Tooting Twirl. They raised £2,000 in a crowdfunder, and they went to that space and they transformed it one sunny Saturday afternoon. And they filled it with flowers and carnival and music and food and fresh coffee. They put real grass down on the ground. I got to sit with my feet, my toes on the green grass of Tooting. And what I noticed that day as the day went past was that the kind of something changed deep underneath our feet. At the beginning of the day, people said, if this was our village green, by the afternoon, people were saying, when this is our village green, something changed as the day went on. I noticed people looking at this wall, the wall of Primark. No one ever looks at this wall. If there was a competition for London's dullest wall, this would definitely be in the top 3. I noticed so many people say, when this is our village green, what will we paint on that wall? What story of ourselves will we paint on that wall? You know, that what if question had changed the sense of what and how people looked at that space in a way that was just delightful to see. This is in Liège in Belgium, where the transition group in Liège 5 years ago came up with a what if question. They said, what if in a generation's time, the majority of food eaten in Liège came from the land closest to Liège? Liège, ceinture alimentaire means food belt. And I went to an event 5 years ago where they invited chefs and farmers and everybody who cared about food to this event to launch the idea. It was brilliant. Then I didn't hear anything for 4 years, and I went back last April. And in that time, they'd created 21 cooperatives. They raised 5 million euros of investment from local people to start these businesses off. They had a farm, they had 2 vineyards, they had a brewery. I had to go and visit the brewery. You know, we all have to make sacrifices. They started a shop called the Small Producers in the center of the city, serving food from the farms around the city. Within 6 months, the first shop was doing so well, they opened a second. They now have 4. The first one has doubled in size. I met the mayor of the city who said, we used to say we wanted to be a smart city. Now we want to be a transition city. This is the story of our city. This is the narrative. Our role as a municipality is just to remove all the blockages to this growing. They're now looking at reimagining the food supply for schools, universities. It's just phenomenal. For me, it was really emotional. As somebody who has spent 12 or 13 years going around with this kind of vision in my head of how the future could be and trying to communicate it to other people, to actually be walking around in it and having my lunch in it and meeting people whose job it was now was just something really very, very special. Yeah, but it started with that what if question. This is the third one, which is one of my favorite what if stories from London. This is in Walthamstow in London. This is Hilary Powell and Dan Edelstein. She's a printmaker, he's a filmmaker. They live in Walthamstow, and they were very moved by seeing how austerity was increasing the debt crisis in their town. And the last bank had closed down. So they took over the bank, and they turned it into what they called an act of citizen money creation. And they started printing these, which are not a local currency. They're artworks. They're limited edition artworks, each signed by the manager of the Hoe Street Central Bank, or the HSCB for short. And when you went to visit, the whole place was full of these notes, all hanging up to dry. They were screen printed and block printed and gold foiled, and as you can see, hanging up behind them to dry. Each of the notes celebrates a different person in that community who is supporting the people who are falling through the gaps caused by austerity. So there's the two Steves who run a project keeping young men out of gangs. There's Tracy, who's the head teacher at the primary school, who lost all of their funding for the arts. There's Gary, who was so moved by seeing the food crisis in Walthamstow that he mortgaged his house to turn his garage into a food bank. And there's Sarah, whose family feed 200 people 2 meals a day every day. These are the heroes we should be celebrating on our local currencies, on things like this. Excuse me. And their aim was that they wanted to sell £50,000 worth of these notes, and they sold them in denominations of 5, 10, 20, and 50. During the evening, the bank was open as a community education place around economics, really amazing. And they sold £50,000 worth of these notes. Half of that money was then given divided between these charities, and there's a lovely film on YouTube of the moment when the head teacher, when Tracy opens a suitcase with £5,500 in front of in a school assembly with all the kids who, wow. The really smart bit is that the other half of it, the other £25,000, they then took to the secondary debt market where debt is bought and sold. And they bought £1.2 million worth of Walthamstow payday lending debt and cancelled the debt. And they wrote to all the people whose debt they'd cancelled and said, you know, that debt you had, you don't have it anymore. And we don't expect anything in return, and thank you and good luck and have a good life. But if you'd like to join us on the 9th of May at a derelict, at a waste ground overlooking Canary Wharf, you'd be very welcome to join us. When people joined them, there was this van painted gold filled with little bits of paper with the word debt written on it. And at 10 o'clock in the morning, they blew the van to pieces in a huge explosion. And all of the people who had bought bonds that they issued, we got sent these in the post. This is a bit of the wreckage from the van. This is a bit of the windscreen that was sent to us as a kind of artwork. It says on here, this artifact is a certified fragment from the wreckage of Big Bang 2, the controlled explosion of 1.2 million of abolished debt, and even minted these special coins from the metal as well. And I love that idea of if you're motivated to try and change something, yes, you could start a petition, you could start an online campaign, or you could take over a bank and fill it with people making stuff and blow up a van and do all kind, you know. Actually, when we bring the imagination to this kind of stuff and we involve artists, the scope can be so much more. So the last one, and then we'll have a short break, is pacts, which might seem a strange kind of a word to be using in relation to imagination. But I feel it's really, really important. All of us will have had experience of being invited to go to something where our imagination is invited and then completely ignored. We go to a consultation, we write our brilliant ideas on post-it notes, we go home, they chuck them in the bin and do what they were going to do anyway. You know, all too often our imagination is kind of invited, but not really invited. And actually, if you're going to invoke and welcome and invite people's imagination, it's so important that we meet it halfway. This is in Derby, where the Derby museums have a building called the Silk Mill, which was the Derby Industrial Museum. It was one of the very first factories in the UK. And a few years ago it closed. It kind of got a bit boring. It was kind of an industrial museum that had kind of run out of steam, so to speak. And they shut it down, and they hired a young woman called Hannah Fox. They said, here are the keys, here's a little bit of money, just have a play and see if you can come up with something. So she ran a series of events, and her what if question was, what if the community redesigned and rebuilt this museum? And from the beginning, the first thing she did was she put a workshop in the heart of the museum and invited volunteers from the community to come and make anything that the museum needed: chairs, display cases, whatever. And then when it came to thinking about how do we want the museum to be in the future, they ran an amazing consultation, and they decided it was going to be a museum of making. And what they've done there as part of then the contract to completely restore this whole building was to do a kind of pioneering reimagining of how that process might work. How do you do a big construction project and maximize the amount of ways in which a community can get involved and interact? And so in the museum reconstruction, the community are involved in every step all the way through in building all the different stuff. It's absolutely fabulous. This woman, the woman holding the microphone here, is called Gabriela Gomez Mont, and she works for the mayor of Mexico City, where she founded what is basically was conceived of as a ministry of imagination, which sounds like something in a Harry Potter book. But in Mexico City, they have it as part of the administration. And when I interviewed her for the book, she said to me, imagination is not a luxury. We should not only be building cities for the human body, but also for the human imagination. The more we distribute the capacity to imagine different futures, the better off we will be. And this is in Bologna, in Italy, where the municipality imagination office, just wonderful. I heard this story 2 months before the deadline for the manuscript, 2 weeks before the deadline for the manuscript. And I was like, oh, how have I not heard that story before? And chasing around and ringing them up. And basically the Civic Imagination Office sits between the municipality and the people, and the municipality had noticed a huge decline in engagement in local democracy, in engagement in all kinds of different ways. And this works by doing visioning and imagining at the community scale. There are 6 Civic Imagination Office laboratories in all the main neighborhoods around the city. And then when the smart bit is that when people come up with a good idea, the municipalities say, that's a great idea. We can offer this, 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 and this to make that happen. What can you offer? That and that? Good. Okay, let's do it then. And they make a pact. And in the last 5 years in Bologna, they've made 500 pacts between the municipality and communities that range from, we're going to put some new benches and some flowers out there, all the way through to, we're going to take over this empty office block and turn it into a school to teach young people to be classical musicians. The Civic Imagination Office is now the main way that the municipality does participatory budgeting. It's now the main way they find uses for empty buildings in the city. It's beautiful. And I said to the guy, why do you talk about imagination? Why don't you just call it like a civic engagement office or something like that? And he said at the beginning, I was very skeptical about using the word imagination because I thought we needed a very practical approach to the people's problems, needs, and capacity. But after 2 years of work on the ground, I have learned that imagine has become one of the most used words in our assemblies. The people want to imagine new ways to solve problems. Imagine is a very simple word. Everyone understands what it is. It's a clever way to speak about how to solve problems in a new way. Just to finish off with a little story of a place where I kind of saw a lot of this stuff all come together. This is in France, in a place called Montsartou, which is about half an hour inland from Nice. In Montsartou, the French government a few years ago issued a law to say that all schools should serve at least 20% organic food. And in Montsartou, they said, well, if 20% is better than 0%, then surely 100% is 5 times better than 20%. Why are we stopping at 20%? That's just daft. So in Montsartou, in all the schools, all the food is 100% organic. And the municipality created a market garden on this piece of land that was going to be developed for housing, and they compulsory purchased the land and turned it into a market garden, which now grows 70% of all the food for all the schools in Montsartou. They grow the biggest chard I've ever seen in my life. They have 3 big polytunnels. They employ 4 people. And one of the things that they found that was so interesting was that so all the kids get involved. They come out to the garden, they know all the different plants. The kids are involved in cooking the food in the schools. They found that in 60% of families who'd never bought organic food before started to change how they did their shopping. You know, they made that change, and the kind of knockdown impacts of it were amazing. So they created space. They created a place, which is really now people come from all across France to see this and learn and go away and do it. They've created practices around actually how to embed this in a school. The kitchens look and feel very different. The dining space feels very different. And it's kind of a pact because the community had said, we want better food for our kids. Well, they heard that and they did this. And it's a win-win-win-win-win project. It's better for public health, mental health, biodiversity, local employment, local economy, everything. So many of the solutions we're looking at in climate change are like this. So that's what I wanted to share with you, was this idea that if we want to accelerate the imagination, we need to be looking at space, place, practices and pacts. And I think the same thing applies in local organizations, in bigger organizations, in universities. I think we can take this and adapt this to a whole range of different scales. So just to wrap up, if you're interested in some of the stuff, so all of the stories that I've talked about and the interviews I've talked about that I did with people, robhopkins.net is the blog that I do, where all of the interviews that were done for the book are all there, and you can read the transcripts, or they're often uses how I like to work. The Transition Network is where you can find out what's happening in the transition movement. There's loads of great resources there. I recently started a new podcast series, so if you get to the end of this and you're interested and you'd like to kind of keep up with what I'm doing and support the work that I do, I've started a new podcast called From What If to What Next that people subscribe to. It's just £3 a month and you get 4 podcasts a month. And it's what the idea is that the listeners send in their what if questions, and I go off and find the best people to explore how that what if question can move from what if to what next. So far with the first one was what if birdsong drowned out the traffic, which was lovely. We did one on what if universal basic income led to a revival of the imagination. We just did one about what if cities relocalize their food supply. And then the next one is going to be what if GPs surgeries were catalysts for transition. So it's kind of shaped by the listeners, and it would be lovely if you wanted to join me on that journey. So I'm going to stop there and to see if Christabel wants to say anything before we just take a little 5-minute stretch and bio break.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rob. That was really an amazing talk. Yeah, if anyone wants to stretch their legs, take an imaginative toilet break, or write down a question to ask Rob.
I'm not quite sure what an imaginative toilet.
Just have a little stretch, or go to the loo and have a think about what question you might want to ask. We'll come back at 1:15. You don't have to go anywhere. You can also just sit and start writing your questions in the chat already. But yeah, the question and answer session will start in 5 minutes, so at 1:15.
See you there.
All right. Looks like a number of people are back and we're at 1:15. So, Rob, there's a couple of questions that have come in the chat. The first one is from is, if you had all the architects in the world in one Zoom call, what's the #1 thing you'd tell them to do for creating a world where humans can live on this planet without destroying it/ourselves?
God, that would be a big Zoom call. I think I would. There'll be a few things. I think I would. I'd love it if we were able to take the same thinking that we use in terms of local food, and the more food that we can source locally, the better that is for the environment and for local economy and stuff. And we could apply this thinking to building materials and to the buildings that we build, and sort of relocalize building in that sense, and to create the markets and stuff around that. I just think we would end up with such a more delightful building. I would say, do you remember that book called Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander that you read when you were at architecture school? Well, get it out again and actually use it for everything that you make. And if you've never heard of that book, it is one of the great works. So I always say that Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander and the works of Captain Beefheart are the great works of genius of the 20th century. So I would say, yeah, I would say to design places that invite curiosity, and to design places that make people feel imaginative and feel like anything is possible in them. And a pattern language is one of the most amazing books because it basically sets out how to design spaces that are beautiful and draws from examples from all around the world. And I think it has so much to offer to this discussion about how we design spaces in which the imagination thrives.
Great. I think the next question is from Hillary. So while they think of themselves as an optimist and someone who's able to imagine, can you share any tips to help them inspire others to use their imagination?
Yeah, I guess I mean, the things that, when we're being imaginative, basically what we're doing is we are drawing from our memory. The imagination and the memory are very similar. They're both in the same part of the brain. And when we're being imaginative, we're basically picking things from our memory and assembling them in new and unique combinations. So we need to have, in the same way that a painter needs a wide range of colors on their palette, we need an imagination that is full of ideas and possibilities. And it's unlikely we come across those unless we actively go and seek them out. So I feel like one of the key things that we can do to help the people around us be more imaginative is to share those stories and to tell stories and to find stories. And it's a lot of my role in the transition movement is being a storyteller and listening out for stories of what's happening in different places and sharing those in as many different ways as I can. So I feel like one of the main ways we can help people with that is to share stories with them and tell them stories of things that we've heard, and just to include those in conversations. Wow, I was hearing about this place where they did that, and do you know in Bristol they've done that, and did you know that in Ireland yesterday the government just said they were going to spend 20% of the whole budget for transport on walking and cycling, and all this kind of, I would just be putting that kind of stuff out to people because we get so overwhelmed with the sense that nothing ever happens and nothing is changing anywhere. And actually, I remember when I went to America years ago, I went there thinking America causes a quarter of all the climate emissions in the world and no one really cares. And actually, when I went there were so many things happening, but none of it ever gets reported in the media. As most of you know, doing amazing projects at a community scale, those stories never get told. Tell those stories, listen out for stories from other places. Stories are really, really infectious. And to plan, one of the things that we did in Totnes when we started Transition Town Totnes from the beginning was to think of projects from the beginning in terms of the story that they would tell. So one of the very first thing we did was, we wanted to plant some trees, some walnut trees, and we were taken with this idea that hybrid walnut trees can produce more carbohydrate and protein a hectare than organically grown wheat. So why don't we plant walnut trees through our towns and cities? And we had a project where we planted 4 walnut trees in the center of town. And rather than just planting some trees, we did a big launch that we said we were declaring Totnes as the nut tree capital of Britain. I mean, Totnes as the nut capital of Britain. I think probably people had assumed that for quite some time. But Totnes as the nut tree capital, we just loved that idea of it being really bold and silly. And as far as I'm aware, no one else has challenged us for that title yet. So we still are the nut tree capital of Britain. But if any of you'd like to challenge us for that title, that would be great too. But again, it's bringing that kind of storytelling piece into the projects that we do.
Thanks, Rob. I'm just trying to collate a few questions. Thanks for putting them all in the chat. Someone asked, how do you contend with your inner and outer skeptic?
My own personal inner and outer skeptic.
Yeah, I'm not sure you have one, but go for it, Rob.
Well, yeah. I mean, I always think, one of the ways that question gets asked is, are you an optimist or a pessimist? And I always say, well, I'm neither really. I feel it's a bit of a waste of energy being one or the other. There's somebody I read recently said, I'm not an optimist or a pessimist, I'm a possibilist, which I quite liked, that it's actually, while things are still possible, I fight for those things and push for those things. I always think if you, as Paul Hawkins said, if you read the climate science, if you read the climate science and you're not a pessimist and you haven't read it properly, go back and read it again. And if you spent any time among the people around the world who are trying to do something about it, and you're not an optimist, then you don't have a heart. That's kind of where I kind of sit with it, really. So my kind of inner cynic and skeptic, I think it's, you know, it's there, but then I spend some time in a place like Liège. I spend some time in a place like Montsartou, and like I don't know how can I say this isn't possible when I see it happening, and I see that it's possible, and I see the kind of the impacts that it has, and how it touches people, and how it transforms a place's sense of its own identity, and it changes people's sense of possibility and hope, and how they think about the future. And, you know, then my kind of inner skeptic kind of gives up at that point, really, I think. It realizes it's fighting a losing battle when, you know, but then obviously, like, you know, like anyone, there are days when things kind of feel hopeless, and like it's not enough. But then, you know, I feel like during COVID-19, you know, if we believe neoliberal economists and people like David Starkey, that actually we should have, after 2 weeks of lockdown, we should have all been out sort of smashing each other's windows and stealing each other's cars and stuff, you know. And actually what happened was the most phenomenal upsurge of mutual support and community, possibly the biggest act of kind of peacetime solidarity in my lifetime, of love, dare I even say love, kind of, you know, around the world, of people making such sacrifices on behalf of each other, and these incredible networks, social networks. And governments tend to dismiss community stuff like that during times when things are going well, and then as soon as things start going badly, they say, oh, these communities are really great, aren't they wonderful? And Boris Johnson says, actually, there is such a thing as community, to which I would think, well, we all knew that, sunshine. And the fact that you didn't know that really says so much about what you do and how you behave and act in the world. The point is, where we move forward from here needs to build off those networks and value those networks and properly resource those networks, rather than assuming that people should always just do everything as volunteers for nothing all the time. We need to build off and resource those networks, rather than just letting them sort of burn out with exhaustion and everything goes back to business as usual again.
Thanks for that, Rob. So another question is, and sorry, I can't see everyone, so if you have had your hand up, maybe just say in the chat if you prefer to just ask your question to Rob directly, or type it in the chat. Our next question is, space and place is great, but practice will be undermined by government as soon as it becomes a threat to the mainstream. Is a citizens' assembly the answer to providing the wherewithal to ensure that new ideas prevail?
Maybe. I don't know. I was one of the contributors to the Citizens' Assembly in Oxford, whenever that was, last year. And I was quite disappointed by it, actually. Because I know some of the organisers of the French Citizens' Assembly that's happening at the moment, which Macron has promised to take seriously and to take on board, and has been quite an amazing kind of amazingly facilitated process, actually, which has gone really deep and taken people on a real journey. I think the one in Oxford didn't feel like it really took people on much of a journey. I don't know how over 2 weekends you can take people who knew nothing about climate change to a point where they're making complex decisions about transport policy. But I think in principle, citizens' assemblies are fantastic, but it felt like it was too squeezed, and it didn't go deeply enough. And people, I think there has to be an emotional journey as part of this. I was arrived at the Oxford one at the beginning of the second weekend, and there was a conversation going around the tables about, so should the target be 2050 or should it be 2040? Or maybe should it be 2030? Is 2030 maybe too ambitious? Maybe it should be 2040. And I didn't see anybody who looked like they hadn't been able to sleep since the last session, because they were they'd really taken on board the scale of climate change, and they hadn't been able to sleep. But if you haven't had that, I don't know how you can really be, you know, the decisions, it was a bit like, should they sign Ronaldo or should they sign Messi? You know, it was like these sort of dates were just flying around. So But I do think that that whole suite of kind of deliberative democracy tools, of which citizens' assembly are one, are really, really fundamentally important to this. And actually, the thing with practices is that, you know, practices can unlock imagination and a different way of thinking at various different scales. And that, when that builds, that's what starts to impact and tip government thinking, I think. I don't think we should ever think, well, governments won't take that on board. You know, actually governments now are starting to move in many parts of the world, taking the climate emergency on and doing some really bold stuff. Just because we live here with the current incumbents that we have doesn't mean that we should ever give up completely on the possibility that governments can respond to imaginative ideas.
Another question, it's quite a practical one. So I'm imagining our community to be a net exporter of green energy using our natural wind resource and sun power. Which other transition community in the UK would suggest we can work with?
Work with what, in what sense? In terms of sharing knowledge or sharing electricity?
I don't know. Who asked that question? Maybe you could clarify. Oh,
that was me. It's Tim. Oh, hi, Rob. Good to see you.
Hi, Tim.
Hi. It was actually that practical bit of you know, it's I guess we feel we've got a community around that are really very supportive. We've tried to take it forward with wind, and you know, we're doing lots around. But I think we're now maybe at that tipping point where we can bring people along, and it'd be nice to feel that, particularly with onshore wind, we can now get lots of people behind. Right, that we're really going to imagine something different. And build a bit of a movement. And you know, yes, we can kind of do it as an individual community, but I'd love to think about this as something that transition can really get behind and say, right, let's imagine a different future. Let's all get together. Food's been great, and you've got some great examples there, but how can we do this around energy? And it feels to me like wind might be what that kind of one to say, look, are people really serious? Are you still worried about the aesthetics when you really understand what's going on, the imagining what the future will be like? Which are the ones that have that kind of willingness to really take things forward and make sure that they put up with those difficult conversations, which we know we'll have.
So the two that leap to mind are Transition Fishguard in Wales, who's put up who bought a 50% stake in a wind turbine, who kind of crowdfunded in the community to put up a wind turbine, and now it generates income for the transition group. They use for a whole range of different projects, so they'd be really good to talk to. The guy Tom there who drove that project, and then also the other the biggest sort of most ambitious kind of transition community energy project is in Bath and West Community Energy. Peter Aper, Bath and West Community Energy. There's also the lovely project, you know, Agamemnon Otero in London. He was one of the people in Transition Brixton at the beginning who started Brixton Energy, which was the community energy project that did 4 big solar projects on some of the poorest housing blocks in Brixton. And he now does a project called Energy Gardens, which is really interesting, where they install solar PV mainland train stations and then build food gardens around the station, funded by the money that comes off the PV. So they'd be good to talk to as well, I think.
Yeah. Thanks, Rob.
Great, nice to see you.
And yes, there's a comment, a push in the chat for Low Carbon Hub, of course, are our local community energy experts. I'm sure you know them, Tim.
Absolutely.
So another question from Nicola in Watlington. So we've asked people to use their imaginations to think about how they'd like Watlington and the area around it to look like, about green spaces, biodiversity, carbon sequestration. And we've got to a great start with the plan, with the green plan, but how do we maintain the enthusiasm during the implementation phase, which I think is probably something that, well, it certainly resonates with my experience. What are your suggestions for maintaining that enthusiasm, Rob?
Maybe to do little kind of mock-ups out in public of how it could be, you know, to sort of mark things out on the ground or create little sort of mini versions, or, you know, find ways to give people kind of a taste of what might be coming. There's a really great event that we did in Totnes, which was called Totnes Declares a Climate Emergency, What Next?, which was Transition to Untitled and Extinction Rebellion together, which was an amazing kind of sort of a future thing, which actually Transition New Mills did recently, and they produced a really great guide to how to do it, which you can find online. I guess as well, it's that thing of always reaching out and bringing in new organizations who weren't part of the conversation before, and bringing it to them and getting their input on it. But I think it's those small things where people can see that things are starting to change. So rather than it being like there'll be consultation, loads and loads of things, and then it'll happen. Could we do and then like there's a bit of it that happens, and a bit of it that happens, and a taste that happens, and so people can see that actually something concrete is happening, and to make sure that each of those events is something that each of those things that happens, you design as much of an event and as much of a splash and as a buzz around cheerio, and as much of a buzz around as you possibly can.
That's great. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, we've got some ideas to create some early wins and some things we can get going on straight away, and then some longer term things. So that's cool. And we're really trying to involve as many of the other organisations in Watlington as we can. And we've built a really good steering group. So it's not just Watlington Climate Action Group that's leading it. So that's cool. I think the next thing is to really kind of keep seeing what we can do to give a taste and communicate what we're doing as we're going along in an interesting way. That's what I take from that. Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Spell, one from you.
Yeah, I've got a question about how does this imaginative process deal with embedded structural inequalities? So you mentioned the art project in Walthamstow, where they kind of they challenged debt head on and even brought up debt and wrote it off. And I think that was an amazing example of how communities can come together and do something which really helps people's lives. But I guess my question is, how does imagination, or can imagination, deal with real structural issues like austerity, which are political, especially when people who are subject to austerity measures are living in conditions which are depressing, which are make it feel like there isn't another world that is possible. So I just wondered if there's anything that you can say about that.
Yeah, that's really the crux for me. Is that when we is that we should be reframing austerity as being an assault on the imagination, as being a direct, when you cut the fundings for libraries and you cut the fundings for the arts and you put people into a state of anxiety and precariousness, is criminal. It's absolutely awful. And it's one of the reasons why in the book I say, we need to, if we're serious about this and we recognize this as a problem, because the reason that as I wrote the book, I came to feel like, we recognize that if we don't feed a population properly in terms of food, if it's not nourished enough, that we see a rise in preventable illness. We recognize that if we don't have a good education system, then a population can't really meet its potential. But sort of just slightly out of our vision, the imagination is kind of dwindling and declining and contracting, and we're not doing anything about it. And the first thing that needs to happen is we need to name it and say, no, this is really precious and this is really important, and a future without imagination is just too horrible to imagine. Sylvia Plath said, what I fear most is the death of the imagination. And when we are creating the conditions, so it's why I argue that I think one of the things we need is a National Imagination Act. We need something which enshrines the right for everyone to have an imaginative life and to have the capacity for that. And the model for that, for me, is the Welsh Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which says that every publicly funded organisation has to set out how it's going to achieve sustainable development, we do a version of that where we say every publicly funded organization has to set out how it's going to achieve the maximum, the best conditions for the imagination to flourish. What would the NHS look like if it was designed in such a way that whether you worked in it or you were going through it as a patient, you know, it was delightful and invited your imagination? And what about if the education system was like this? It's a kind of a profound question. It's a profound kind of reprioritizing of things. It's not something that, you know, you and I sort of in the next few weeks can just say, okay, we're going to deal with the impacts that the decline of imagination has had on the more vulnerable people in society. It's a profound shift, and it's why we need artists as part of this, fundamentally involved in all the things that we do, because they can reach people and touch people in a way that you and I maybe struggle to do. But it's a really profound question that actually, if we create the conditions whereby if you go to a state school, the arts are being almost completely designed out of the system to the degree that they almost don't exist anymore in some schools. And whereas if you go to a private school, they have amazing theatre facilities and amazing art studios and literature, because they recognise that a rounded person needs all of those things. Whereas in the state sector, it's just being disappeared. So it's the question, which is why I wrote the book. You know, actually, we need to put this back and give this some priority and some focus. But in our projects, we need to be recognizing that we need to be involving everybody and starting, you know, in France there's a place called Grand Sainte, which is near Dunkirk. It's kind of in the northwest of France, near Dunkirk. And it's a pretty bleak place. It's a third of people are below the poverty line. It's been a bit of a kind of immigration dumping ground for a long time. And unlike Macron, who said, right, we're going to tackle climate change and we're going to put 5 pence on diesel or something across the board, which led to everybody quite rightly kicking off. What they do in Grand Sainte is they say, every measure that we take for climate change has to benefit the poorest people in this place first. So they made all the public transport free in the whole city. All the social housing going in is passive house, social housing. Around the poorest apartment blocks, they dug up all the concrete and tarmac and put in gardens so everybody can have an allotment, and it just looks amazing with all these gardens. And then they changed all the street lighting in the city to low energy street lighting and save £500,000 on their energy bill a year. And rather than just pocketing the difference, they distribute that money as an income boost to all of the poorest people in the city. So I think, you know, when we're also planning actions, if we plan them so they benefit the poorest people, then we start to maybe create some space for imagination from the bottom up as well.
Great, thanks, Rob. So I've got a couple more, and then I might just ask one at the end. I think we won't take any more unless people want to put a really juicy question in the chat in the next minute. So Tim has another one, which is essentially, is there a transition group that would embrace being an early pilot for driverless cars?
Sorry about the music in the background. This is what being locked down with teenagers does to one. I've got no idea. I don't know. You'd have to ask them.
I mean, the thought behind it, Rob, was that kind of, I guess, again, one of my visions is not just our community, but I go somewhere like, in the Cotswolds, you've got places like Burford, and you walk down it and you think, how different would this feel, you know, if you just didn't have all the cars parked up and down it? And so that for me would be one of the visions of the kind of what is, and something that everyone would embrace, that kind of equivalent of the children playing in the streets, but just being able to take over those streets. And it feels to me like that first community that kind of really embraces trying to, because there are going to be challenges when we get to driverless cars and what's going to happen when you make choices that, you know, you don't want things. And it feels to me like, you know, if we can get some communities that really want to make this happen for the positive reasons and help those that want to make driverless cars happen, it just feels like there could be a good connection there, but I don't see the connection being made. So that was, I guess, why I threw it up there.
I guess it's one of those things where, you know, if there was a kind of a firm proposal that someone said we're looking for somewhere to pilot things, and we, you know, there are, you know, however many 100 transition groups there are in the UK, we can just put the idea out and see who bites, really, I guess.
Yeah. Anthony has got a question, which is, I'll maybe let you read. It's in the chat, Rob. Could you read that one? Apologies, just a little bit longer.
The trajectory of emissions reduction required is very steep. Most people are unaware this is necessary. Otherwise, shall I read it? Can everyone see it? I'll read it out. The trajectory of emissions reductions required is very steep. Most people are unaware this is necessary, or otherwise how to achieve this. Any advice to change attitudes, behavior, and commitment? Also, how to educate. For example, most people talk about local food. As Mike Berners-Lee and Dr. Poor and many others say, it's what we eat, animal produce, not how far it's traveled, that matters for food emissions. How to change attitudes, behavior, and commitment? I don't know. That's a very, very big question. I think that other people can. I'm sure there are other people here who can answer that as well as I can. I guess my sense is that one of the ways that I've seen that we can really change attitudes and behavior is by getting people together on their streets and doing it street by street. We did a program called Transition Streets in Totnes, which was where we would get 6 to 10 neighbors together, and they'd meet 7 times in each other's houses, talk about water one week, food the next week, energy the next week. On average, they cut their carbon emissions by 1.3 tons per house. The national average is 9 tons, I think. They saved themselves about £600-700 a year. But the thing that was most interesting was that when we did a big survey afterwards, of what people got out of being part of it, no one mentioned the carbon or the money. Everybody talked about how they knew their neighbors better and felt like they were part of a community. And so that was kind of our attempt at how do you change behavior. I mean, what do you do? Do you send people a DVD in the post? Do you know? And so that felt like a really, really skillful way of doing it to me. I feel as well like a lot of behaviors are changing around meat and dairy and changing in that way. And I was really heartened during COVID-19 during the lockdown, the number of surveys of people saying we don't want to go back to how it was before. And I feel like that sort of permission is really starting to change. How to educate people around food. I mean, I know what they mean about local food, but I also think there is something about local food that goes beyond just looking at it purely from an energetic perspective. There is something about, you know, what they're doing in Liège is not just about reducing carbon emissions from travel, even though that's really, really important. You know, what they're doing there is creating a whole new culture around food and reconnecting a city to the land around it and reimagining the economy and reimagining. I spoke to the guy Pascal, who's the manager of one of the first small producer shop. And I said to him, how far can this go? What is the potential of this? And he said, I think by the time we have 12 shops, the supermarkets will start to fragilize. This beautiful word in French, fragiliser. The supermarkets will start to fragilize. You know, that actually, if we can be building these new networks and these new systems, and we can tie that in with, yesterday I was on a really interesting webinar run by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation about food and circular economies, where incredible stuff going on, where they're looking at getting down to zero waste in terms of urban food and growing food and processing food. And, you know, that whole kind of culture that emerges from that, it's not just, it kind of goes beyond local food. And they said that actually the best way to get people to look at food indifferently is to cook them a really good meal.
That sounds like a really good way, and I know it's something that a lot of CAGs do, and I can probably feel some tummies rumbling as well.
Yes,
I'm maybe going to use my facilitator privilege to ask one last question, and there's lots I want to ask you, Rob, but I probably will just get in touch. I think probably it's sort of, I think one of the things that brings us all together on this call is, you know, we're all part of different initiatives locally, in this case in Oxfordshire, to make change happen, you know, to make our communities better places, tackle climate change. And obviously you've been doing that a lot longer than certainly I have, but maybe than some of us as well. And I guess if you could go back to maybe the beginning of your journey into trying to make these changes happen, you know, what advice would you give to yourself? I don't know how long ago it would be for you, Rob, I don't want to guess, but you know, what advice would you give to yourself if you were starting out?
I would say to believe that you're doing the right thing, and and people will catch you up. You're just a bit ahead, but don't worry, people will catch you up. I would say to look after yourself in terms of burnout. Pace yourself. This is a marathon. This is not a sprint. You know, give yourself time to breathe. Give yourself time off. Give your family the time that they need. You know, don't burn yourself out, because our movements over the years are littered with people who've burnt themselves out, and burnout is horrible. And you'll be much more effective if you can sustain yourself. And I would say as well, to try as best as you can to bring a kind of an entrepreneur's brain to projects, because if we imagine that all of this is going to happen purely driven by volunteers, and we're going to make the level of change that needs to happen over the next 10 years just with volunteers, we're really kidding ourselves. And we have to be looking at project ideas we come up with kind of in a way that kind of good entrepreneurs would look at them and say, how can we create jobs out of this? How can this be financially sustainable? So the brewery that we started that I mentioned, we now employ 6 people. It's one of my favorite projects that I'm part of, but for me the most precious thing about it is that there are now 6 people who can pay their mortgage, who couldn't do so before, and who can raise their family who couldn't do so before. And if we get transition right, if we get the move to a more resilient local economy right, we should be creating hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of jobs, and should be becoming the main employer in the area where we live. And if we can bring that kind of mentality to it, rather than assuming, because the risk is that if we just assume we can do everything with everybody being volunteers, that we are going to end up with almost exclusively middle-class white movements. And unless we can get to a point where we are creating work for people, you know, like the cooperative movement was a few white guys in the room who had an idea, and then within 10 years they were creating hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of jobs, and they became the new economy. And then the debate wasn't about whether co-ops were a good idea anymore, because they were creating jobs for people. And I think we have to bring that kind of awareness and that kind of expertise to this as well.
Thanks, Rob. I think that's probably a really nice point to leave it at. And I just, as by way of sort of leaving in some sort of way together, I just wanted to invite people, if you want to put in, you know, what if question that you're taking away from this evening into the chat, if you want to, and then we can maybe share. Christopher and I can maybe share those afterwards if you want to add a what if question in there to close. Otherwise, yeah, thank you again, Rob, from CAG Oxfordshire and all of the CAGs, and I'm sure lots of thanks coming in the chat also, for joining us this evening and sharing your experience and wisdom. And go buy Rob's book, but not from Amazon or something like that, I guess. And
do please subscribe to the podcast. It's just £3 a month. It enables me to do what I do. And the podcasts so far have been really great, and it'll just grow, and it'll be shaped by the questions that you put in, and there's some great ones coming up, so it'd be lovely for you to join me on that journey. And Kate, someone just mentioned Kate Rayworth, so she's going to be on one of the ones soon about what if cities use donut economics with the Deputy Mayor of Amsterdam as well. So do come and join me on that. And thank you all so much, and see you again. And I'm going to watch your questions.
Thanks. Yeah, we'll keep the call open for a bit if you want to add things in the chat. Otherwise, thank you everyone for joining us, and enjoy your evening. And hopefully catch you at the CAG AGM on the 30th of July.
Don't miss it.
Don't miss it. Endorsement from Rob for our wonderful AGM. Democracy is important, everyone. See you there.